Hello, and thank you to the organizers of the third Asia Regional Meeting of the International Plato Society for inviting me to present at this conference and for letting me share my work in this recording. My name is Jenny Strandberg, and I will be part reading, part summarizing my paper, Faking It Right, the King as a Precise or Informed Imitator of the True Statesman. So the Statesman exhibits Plato's ambiguous relation to images and imagination. On the one hand, inauthentic statesmen are said to preside over insubstantial images on the largest scale. By reigning over these semblances, they are the greatest imitators and magicians, and so the greatest sophists among sophists. On the other hand, there are good imitations of the true constitution and statesmen, namely law-abiding forms of government and their rulers. The best of them is the king, who rules on the basis of opinion and according to laws. The visitor even asserts that the king should not be distinguished by name from the person with expert knowledge in governing. Yet the king is decidedly an imitator, whose constitution is defined as incorrect in relation to the true one. The fact that image and imagination are used in this contradictory fashion as good and bad copymaking, excuse me, in the sequel to the Sophist should not come as a surprise. The visitor has made clear in his preceding conversation with Theaetetus that imitation has two parts. Some imitators know what they're imitating and some don't. Thus, they divided imitation along the line of having versus lacking knowledge. The objective of this paper is to shed light on how this division plays out in the Statesman. It identifies the king as a precise mimic of the true statesman and the tyrant as an insincere belief mimic, a demagogue and fake statesman. Aristocrats, oligarchs, and democrats are of the same ilk. They are sophists and experts in faction, not true politicos. In contention with the hegemonic interpretation of the dialogue, I argue that the king ruling with opinion and law avoids the sophist label and is the only precise imitator of the highest political ideal. Hence, among known political leaders, only the king is faking it right. The first part of my paper analyzes the image-making expertise in the sophist. And the sophist is, of course, about trying to define what a sophist is. And the visitor hesitates to associate the soul-cleansing act of refutation with sophistry, even as Theaetetus insists that there are affinities. There are similarities between a wolf and a dog too, the visitor says there. And if you're going to be safe, you have to be especially careful with about similarities, since the type we're talking about is very slippery. So to define the sophist it's very difficult. The sophist is a very slippery kind of figure. This short exchange is a preview of what is to come in the Statesman, where the true statesman and the tyrant are found to be indistinguishable in their outward appearance. Both are monarchs, one-person rulers, who call themselves kings and act contrary to law when other actions appear to them better. Whereas the true statesman's judgment to disobey the law is based on knowledge of what is best for city and citizens, the tyrant's judgment is rooted in ignorance and selfish desires. but the presence and absence of knowledge in the soul is not immediately evident to the external observer. To be safe, then, they must be especially careful when it comes to similarities, because the greatest sophist among sophists, the tyrant, is also most adept at passing as the true statesman. And this is why they start dividing up the expertise of image making. First into likeness making and appearance making. So truthful representation versus a more deceptive likeness that may look like the model when observed from afar, but when you take a closer look, it's not like it. And imitation will fall under appearance making. So imitation always involves a degree of falsity. Because imitation is using oneself as a tool in the appearance making. And on the other side of this divide is using tools to make appearances. Out of imitation, they distinguish precise mimicry and belief mimicry, or from belief mimicry. To properly imitate someone in body or voice, one must have knowledge of that person and her manners. So since that imitation is based on knowledge, it's called precise mimicry. Some people translate it informed, others scientific. But it's also possible to imitate what one does not know, as when someone has false beliefs about the nature of justice, but nevertheless wants to appear to be just. This imitation is then based on belief and called belief mimicry. Under belief mimicry, they will eventually find the sophist as the insincere belief mimic, someone who is or pretends to be like the wise, exercising the noble art of refutation, but in reality is trying to win debates and tripping up their opponents. So this type of imitator is the most similar to the wise in outward appearance, and yet most unlike them because entirely ignorant. And this is the sophist proper. So in the second part, I discuss an error that surrounds the topic of imitation in the Statesman. To understand Plato's political project in this dialogue, the topic of imitation is very central. I begin by defining what I call the first principle of ruling, which is that which governed the true constitution. So the true constitution is being identified as being ruled by political leaders who act to preserve it on the basis of expert knowledge and what is just, making it better than it was so far as they can. All constitutions not based on this principle are mimetic or inauthentic, not really constitutions at all, says the visitor, but imitation of the correct one. Those we say are law-abiding have imitated it for the better, the others for the worse. So the leaders of these mimetic constitutions are not what they make themselves out to be. They are impersonators. And so my question is, are they precise mimics or belief mimics or both, to use the language of the sophist? And further, How can mimetic politicians resemble true statesmen without being them? In what way is it possible to err when mimicking a political ideal? So we must first find out what the errors are that occurs in relation to imitation. We know that imitation always involves a degree of falsity, but how does that really play out in the political arena? In my analysis, it is first by abandoning this first principle of governing and employing layman legislation that the first error occurs in relation to imitation. So this is how inferior so-called law states are formed. Law states are nevertheless better than lawless constitutions, which give leaders free range to exploit and oppress people for personal gain. If someone were brazen enough to act contrary to these laws, says the visitor, he would be committing a many times greater mistake and would overturn all expert activity to a still greater degree than do the written rules. And so this is the second error that is many times greater than the first, and that is to not follow the laws at all. So it's easy to be convinced that lawlessness is a significant flaw with some mimetic constitutions, but it is harder to understand why ruling in accordance with law is a mistake at all, or an error. So the visitor has to show why the law states are inferior to the true constitution, which he does, and I'm not going to go into exactly how he does that, but it is my conclusion that both types of government, lawless and lawful ones, are flawed. They're besieged with inaccuracies, and therefore merely copies of the true constitution. So at this point, I want to return to the question of whether good imitators of the true statesman are perhaps precise mimics and bad imitators are belief mimics, or if there's like this blend of both here among mimetic constitutions. And in my opinion, I think it is safe to say then that the leaders of the lawless constitutions are bad imitators. And that little later in the dialogue, the visitor calls all politicians whose constitutions are not based on knowledge experts in faction and fake statesmen. So they are really sophists, he concludes. So I think we can, since sophists are defined as insincere belief mimics in the sophist, the dialogue, the sophist, we may safely assume that the leaders of lawless constitutions are of this kind, given that they are considered especially poor in relation to the true one. The question that remains to be answered is if there are any precise mimics. So are there any good mimics of the true statesman who qualify as precise mimics or impersonators? So to answer that, we have to address the complex relation between the three monarchs. On the one hand, the ideal, the true statesman. Then we have a king who rules with opinion and law, and a tyrant involved in this dialogue. They're all monarchs. They could all potentially be experts in statesmanship, which the many or the rule by the many cannot be. So this is what I try to do in the third part, to elucidate on this relation between the three monarchs. So first, the visitor makes clear which intentions and actions would be identical with those of the true statesman, at least in outward appearance. So he says, anyone for whom there are written laws established, who undertake to do anything at all that is different, contrary to these, on the grounds that it is better, will be doing, won't they, the same thing as the true expert as far as they can. Next, there's going to be a split here between the original and also the bad copy, because those acting contrary to law and providing the same rationale for doing so as the true statesman, but without having expert knowledge, would be undertaking to imitate what is true, but would imitate it altogether badly. So that is the bad copy. If rulers perform the same actions for the same reason while having expert knowledge, they would no longer be imitators. Their constitutions would be that very thing that is most truly what it sets out to be. So that would be the original. So there is no good copy established, only a bad one and the original. When the visitor goes on to define the good copy or good imitation, it will appear as less accurate than the bad one, strangely enough. For it seems that when one ruler acts neither according to laws nor according to customs, but pretends to act like the person with expert knowledge, saying that after all one must do what is contrary to what has been written down if it is best, this is a more precise imitation of the true statesman than when someone rules merely on the basis of opinion according to laws. But from the vantage point of knowledge, the opposite is true. That it is clear that the former is a worse imitation, because the ruler is merely pretending to be like the true statesman, when in fact there is some desire or other combined with ignorance controlling this imitation. Compare this with the ruler who is governing with opinion and laws and said to imitate the person with expert knowledge well enough to be indistinguishable by name from the true statesman. Thus, if the visitor thinks that the king who rules with opinion and law ought to share title with the true statesman, we may assume that she is a good mimic of this ideal. Indeed, the king is a more precise mimic than the most excellent one who acts exactly like the true statesman, because the latter doesn't know what she is imitating. She goes through the motions of being a true statesman, but it's all an empty charade. Whereas the king, who also lacks knowledge, has an opinion in statesmanship that we must assume is of a superior quality, given that the king ought to share title with the true statesman. Yes, so the picture that emerges from reading the Statesman is one of an unattainable political ideal founded in knowledge, but approximated by a person who rules on the basis of opinion and law. Plato communicates the superiority of this imitation by letting the mimetic rulers share title with the true original. Moreover, if a person who really possesses expert knowledge in governing comes around, she should not call herself true statesman, but king, says the visitor. From this, we draw the conclusion that even the power of the true statesman ought to be restrained by the rule of law in practical reality. Clearly, the only person who is brash enough to claim to be the true statesman is the one who is completely ignorant in statesmanship and controlled by some desire or other. By pretending to rule according to the first principle of governing, saying that, after all, one must do what is contrary to what has been written down, if it is the best, she reveals herself as a sinister impostor. By presenting herself as genuine, she exposes herself as a fraud. Surely, in those circumstances, we must call every such person a tyrant, concludes the visitor. And with this, the wolf has been distinguished from the dog, as the visitor signaled was necessary in the Sophist. So we see the downfall of the tyrant in her identical outward appearance to the true statesman. It is her claim to authenticity that reveals her inauthenticity, since not even the ruler with expert knowledge would claim to have attained the highest political ideal. Whereas the hubris of the tyrant ruins her disguise and reveals her status as an ignorant, insincere belief mimic, the king is able to imitate the true statesman precisely by accepting her human epistemic limitations. The success of monarchy depends on written laws and the king's opinion, which we assume is a good one, perhaps even the highest possible insight one can gain into political governance, if knowledge proper is not within reach. The opinion is at least good enough for the for the king who possesses it to share the title with a true statesman. But doesn't the king have some form of knowledge? Even if it's not knowledge of statesmanship per se, the king must know of this political ideal well enough to imitate it. Therefore, I argue that the king is a precise mimic whose imitation is based on knowledge of the true statesman ideal. So not of statesmanship itself, but of the statesman ideal, and is imitating this ideal. So that's the end of my presentation. I have one part left of my paper, and that is to show that that it's only the king that is a precise mimic. But I will end here. And thank you so much for listening and for allowing me to share my work with you. If you have any comments or questions or would like to discuss my paper further or how it relates to your work, please don't hesitate to reach out, and you can email me at strandj@farmingdale.edu.